I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and the location looked quiet. It was a small cabin tucked just past the edge of a rural neighborhood, surrounded by fields that ran up against a line of old woods. The listing showed a clean, rustic interior, polished wood floors, and large windows that let in light. When I arrived, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the driveway. The gravel crunched sharply under the tires as I parked. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but it had a charm that felt cozy at first glance. The wood siding was weathered, some of it gray and cracked, but the front door had a fresh coat of paint. There were no neighbors in sight, just the faint outline of other houses far off down the road, separated by fields. The isolation seemed like a bonus, a chance to finally unplug for a weekend. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and cleaning supplies. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I explored the rooms. The living room was modest, with a small sofa, a coffee table, and a gas heater tucked in a corner. The kitchen was compact, with a tiny stove and a refrigerator that hummed quietly. Everything looked serviceable, but not new. There were no personal touches, no books or decorations beyond a few generic prints on the walls. I unpacked quickly, laid out my clothes, and made a cup of coffee. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the room darkened quickly, the cabin's single ceiling light giving off a yellow glow. I noticed the sound of the heater clicking and settling, its rhythms strangely loud in the quiet of the house. I spent the evening reading in the living room, occasionally glancing out the window at the darkening fields. The wind picked up, brushing through the trees at the edge of the woods and rattling the edges of the siding. I thought about going to bed early, but I was restless. I wandered through the small hallway that led to the bedrooms, noting the doors and the thin walls. Everything seemed ordinary, but the cabin's silence felt absolute, as if the air itself was thicker than usual. Every small noise, the refrigerator's hum, the heater's clicks, the occasional bird call from the fields, sounded amplified. I tried to ignore it, telling myself the isolation was part of the experience. I went to bed around 10, leaving a small lamp on. The mattress was firm, the sheets clean but slightly rough. I closed my eyes, but the quiet made it impossible to fall asleep immediately. Every time I thought I heard a sound, my heart would tighten. It was probably the wind or the old wood shifting. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off, only to wake around 2 in the morning. I was certain I had heard footsteps. They were faint, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside the bedroom. I stayed still, listening, but the sound stopped as quickly as it started. I told myself it was impossible that I was alone. The house was small. If anyone else were there, I would have seen them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound had been real. I got up to check, moving slowly, careful not to make noise. The hallway was dark except for the glow from the lamp I left on in the living room. The rooms were empty, nothing disturbed. I checked the kitchen and living room. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Still, the sense of being watched persisted. I tried to rationalize it, the isolation, the darkness, the fact that I was somewhere unfamiliar, but it didn't help. I went back to bed, keeping the lamp on this time. I couldn't sleep again for hours, my ears straining for the faintest noise. The next morning, I tried to distract myself by making breakfast and walking outside. The cabin looked peaceful in daylight. The sun revealed the rough texture of the siding, the overgrown grass along the edge of the property, and the dark line of trees that marked the boundary of the woods. The air smelled damp but fresh, a mix of earth and morning frost. I walked down the driveway, scanning the surroundings, looking for any signs of another person. There was nothing, no footprints, no vehicles, no evidence anyone had been near the cabin recently. Still, the memory of the previous night's sounds lingered. I spent the day exploring the nearby fields, hoping the open space would calm me. The woods were quiet, thick with underbrush and trees that blocked the wind. I didn't go in far, but even standing at the edge of the tree line felt unsettling. Shadows moved oddly in the afternoon sun. I noticed that at certain angles, the cabin seemed completely hidden from view, tucked into a small dip in the land. Returning later, I felt the isolation more sharply. The cabin looked the same, but the quiet now had weight. Every creak of the wood, Every distant bird call felt pointed, deliberate, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. I try to occupy myself by reading or organizing my things, but the unease lingered, building slowly, almost imperceptibly. Night fell again. I ate a small dinner and then tried to relax on the sofa. The heater clicked and hissed as it warmed the room. I noticed small things I hadn't the night before. The uneven floorboards, the way the light from the lamp flickered against the walls, the faint drafts around the windows. The air in the cabin seemed colder in certain corners. Around 11, I heard again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway outside the bedroom. My stomach sank. I froze, heart pounding. I considered leaving the cabin immediately, but felt trapped, unsure if stepping into the hallway was safe. I stayed in bed, listening, eyes wide, counting each step that never came. The sound stopped again, but the tension remained, a heavy pressure that made the room feel smaller. By morning, I decided to leave early. I packed quickly, careful not to make a sound. I checked every corner, every room, convinced I might see evidence of someone's presence. There was nothing. The cabin was empty, unchanged, just as I'd found it. Driving away, I felt a lingering tension, a sense that something had been there with me, watching, but without leaving a trace. I didn't return to that area, and I never booked a cabin in isolation again. Even now, I remember the silence and the creaks, the way the cabin seemed ordinary and yet impossibly, unsettlingly aware of me. The fear wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was slow, creeping, and unforgettable. I booked the Airbnb on a whim, looking for a quiet weekend away from the city. The listing was modest, a small house on the edge of town with a large garden and dense woods behind it. The photos made it look inviting, bright, tidy, a cozy porch. But there was an undercurrent I didn't notice until I arrived. The street was narrow, lined with houses that looked abandoned or poorly kept, and the air had a damp heaviness. I parked in the gravel driveway and got out, my boots crunching against the stones, feeling the chill of the late afternoon seeping through my jacket. The house looked smaller in person. The paint was faded, the trim peeling, the steps to the porch uneven and splintered. I tried to ignore it as I carried my bag inside. The door opened with a low creak. Inside, the smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. The air was cool but stagnant. I dropped my bag on the floor of the narrow hallway and started inspecting the place. The living room was small, the carpet threadbare, the furniture mismatched and worn. A sofa sagged in the middle, and a coffee table had a deep scratch along one edge. I set my bag down and moved to the kitchen, which was slightly brighter, though the overhead light flickered. The counters were cluttered with small appliances that hadn't been used in years, and the sink had a faint layer of grime along the edges. I ran the tap, and brownish water came out first. It cleared after a few seconds, but the sound unsettled me. I tried to tell myself it wasn't that bad, that I could make it work for a night or two. I unpacked minimally and set my things on the dresser in the bedroom at the back of the house. The walls were thin, and I could hear every creak of the floorboards above. The room was small, a single window overlooking the overgrown backyard, the curtains frayed and dust-streaked. The bed was lumpy but seemed serviceable, and I pulled the covers back to check the sheets. They smelled faintly of bleach, though the mattress had a persistent odor of damp and something sour I couldn't place. I shrugged and decided I could sleep anyway. Evening fell quickly. The house was quiet except for the occasional hum of a car passing far down the street and the rustle of wind through the trees. I made a cup of tea in the kitchen, the kettle rattling and hissing as I waited. I sat at the table, sipping slowly, and started to notice small things I hadn't earlier. The hallway had a shadowy corner near the stairs where the wallpaper had peeled away, and the floorboards seemed to shift slightly under my weight. I chalked it up to old construction. The backyard was dark beyond the fence, the trees forming an almost impenetrable wall, and every time the wind moved them, a scraping sound echoed across the house. I tried to settle in, telling myself I would just read for a while before bed. The light in the living room flickered again, more insistently this time. I got up to check the bulb. It wasn't loose, but the socket made a buzzing sound when I touched it. I moved to the hallway, and my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, bouncing off the thin walls. Then I noticed the bedroom door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. I was sure I closed it, though I had no memory of leaving it that way. I pushed it gently, and it swung open to reveal the dark room. I told myself it was the wind. I spent the next hour walking through the house, checking each room, making sure nothing was out of place. In the kitchen, a small chair had been nudged slightly away from the table. In the living room, the rug had a crease I didn't remember. My anxiety built with each detail. I kept checking my phone for a signal, but it was weak and inconsistent. Messages and emails took minutes to load, leaving me feeling isolated. I could hear every faint sound in the house. The drip of a faucet somewhere, the scratch of a loose shutter against the window, the occasional scuttle of something small on the walls. Night came fully, and I went to bed, pulling the covers tight. The room felt colder than before, the air damp and clinging to my skin. I couldn't sleep easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the shapes in the corners of the room moving. The sound of the trees scraping against the siding sounded louder, sharper, closer. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room, slow and deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited, tense, and finally drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke at dawn, the first weak light filtering through the curtains. The house was silent. I went through it methodically, room by room. Everything seemed as it should, though the feeling of unease lingered. I ate breakfast at the small table in the kitchen, staring out at the yard, trying to convince myself it had all been my imagination. I packed my things slowly, checking the corners of every room before leaving. As I locked the door behind me, I realized I hadn't checked the attic. I looked up at the small hatch in the ceiling, the knob dusty and untouched. I told myself it didn't matter. Driving away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something watching from the yard. The street was empty, quiet, the air still heavy. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, the feeling of tension slowly easing with each mile. Later, when I thought back on it, I realized the house itself hadn't done anything overtly threatening. Everything that had unsettled me was small, human scale, plausible, but the combination of isolation, disrepair, and silence had made it unbearable. That weekend had been just a short stay, but it stayed with me because it reminded me how much the ordinary can become frightening when you are alone, stripped of control, and confronted with a space that feels just slightly wrong in every detail. I rented the beach house off-season, a narrow, two-story structure tucked back from the dunes with weathered gray siding and shuttered windows. The air smelled faintly of salt and decay, the way the ocean leaves a tang of brine even when the waves are far away. I arrived late afternoon, dragging my bag across the sand-strewn walkway, noticing how quiet it was. No one else in sight. The tide had retreated, leaving dark, wet sand stretching toward the horizon, and the wind pushed against the siding in low, uneven gusts that rattled the shutters. The house seemed empty, almost abandoned, but everything inside was intact. Linens were folded on the bed, kitchenware in drawers, the refrigerator stocked with basics: milk, bread, eggs. It was exactly what I had expected from the photos: tidy, sparse, quiet. I liked the quiet. The first night was unremarkable. I slept with the sliding door closed, listening to the soft thrum of the wind and the distant murmur of the surf. The second morning, I explored the house more thoroughly. The main living area had a low ceiling, painted white, and the floors were pale hardwood that creaked lightly underfoot. The bedrooms were on the upper floor, small but functional. In the hallway, I noticed a panel at the base of the wall near the stairs, a rectangular piece of wood screwed in with old, rusted fasteners. The listing had described the house as having a crawl space for maintenance, but I never thought much of it. I didn't open it. It was unassuming, easily ignored. That night, I went to bed early. I had spent the day walking along the empty beach, collecting driftwood, and reading under the dim light of the bedroom lamp. The wind had picked up, battering the siding and shaking loose grains of sand that scraped against the windows. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was rats or maybe a raccoon under the house. The scratching was slow, deliberate, each movement measured. I lay still, listening. The sound seemed to move, shifting along the floorboards as though something were testing them, probing, trying to determine where weight was concentrated. My stomach sank. It wasn't haphazard. There was a rhythm, a purpose. I told myself it had to be an animal. Maybe the panel led to the crawl space, and a raccoon had found its way in. I tried to convince myself, but the noises continued, escalating slightly in intensity. There was a sense of awareness in them, as though whatever was underneath knew I was there, tracking me without showing itself. My mind started scanning possibilities, every scenario more unsettling than the last. I considered calling the police, but it felt absurd. A call in the middle of the night about a creature under the floor would make me sound crazy. I stayed in bed, frozen, trying to convince myself it was just the old house settling. The scratching turned into heavier thuds, the sound of weight shifting from one section to another. I realized with a sinking certainty that it wasn't random. Someone could be under the house, testing the floor, seeing how far they could move without being detected. My heartbeat accelerated. I considered getting up, leaving a note, securing the doors, but fear pinned me in place. Every creak in the boards above, every small shift in the wind made my anxiety spike. I stayed in bed, gripping the sheets, listening to the crawl space breathing, moving beneath me. The night stretched endlessly. By dawn, the noises had stopped. I didn't sleep again. I packed my things quickly, careful not to make noise, and left before the sun was fully over the horizon. I drove without stopping, my hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying the night over and over, trying to rationalize it. When I returned home, I avoided thinking about the house, but a sense of unease lingered. Weeks later, I went online to check the listing, thinking perhaps I could warn someone or at least read the reviews. The listing had been removed entirely. No trace, no other rentals by the same host. I asked friends if they remembered seeing the house online, if it was possible it had been renamed or relisted elsewhere. No one recalled it. It was as though it had never existed, at least in the public record. The details I remembered, the panel in the hallway, the way the floorboards responded to weight above, the layout of the small kitchen and the narrow stairs, were all I had. It left a cold impression in my chest, a memory of vulnerability I could not explain. I thought about calling the local authorities near the coast, but the information I had was minimal. No address, no name, nothing concrete. The experience left me cautious about rentals, particularly off-season ones in remote locations. I still remember the feel of the floor under my feet, how the crawl space panel looked like it was always watching, like it was a small, passive observer of the room. Even months later, walking through other houses, I would glance at floor panels, gaps under doors, imagining weight shifting, just out of sight. The house itself had not been remarkable in any way, but the sense of exposure and the realization that someone could be there without detection made it impossible to dismiss. I never went back. I never tried to track the host. The quiet, empty beach I had enjoyed became a source of anxiety and memory. What mattered was the certainty that it had been deliberate. The scraping, the weight, the precise awareness of my location. It could not have been anything else. Weeks later, the removal of the listing confirmed the suspicion. It was not random. I had stumbled into a situation that could have ended far worse if I had stayed. The house, the crawl space, the noises, they were all a warning I did not need to fully understand to respect. The lesson stayed with me. An empty, quiet house does not guarantee safety. Even in a place that appears abandoned, someone can occupy the margins, testing, observing, waiting. The memory is vivid. The wind against the siding, the salt in the air, the dim light over the hardwood floors, and the feeling of being watched remains. I keep it with me as a reminder of the line between comfort and exposure, the fragility of privacy, and the ease with which it can be violated in a space that seems, at first, completely safe. I have been driving for hours, the kind of long, solitary trip that erases your sense of time. The snow had started lightly in the late afternoon, a soft, almost peaceful powder, but by the time I reached the city outskirts, it had turned into a storm that hammered the roads and made visibility barely a few yards ahead. I had booked an Airbnb apartment in advance, mostly because I didn't want to risk driving any further in those conditions. The confirmation had seemed normal, a standard one-bedroom in a mid-rise building downtown. Nothing unusual, nothing that would hint at what was coming. Finding the building was harder than I expected. The snow had piled along the curbs, and the streetlights flickered through the falling flakes, casting pale halos across the wet asphalt. I circled the block twice before spotting the entrance, a narrow glass door set into a faded brick facade. My tires crunched over the icy patch leading up to it, and I pulled up, shivering as the wind cut through the car. I had the key code from the host and punched it in, the beeping lock opening after a long, tense moment. Inside, the building smelled faintly of damp carpet and cleaning chemicals. The lobby was almost empty, just a small bench and a bulletin board with local flyers plastered in disorder. The elevator ride was quiet. The walls were painted an off-white that had dulled over time, the ceiling lights buzzing softly above me. The apartment number was at the end of a short hallway, its door pale wood with a brass handle. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers stiff from the cold, and eventually managed to get inside. The apartment itself was small but tidy. The lights were already on, warm and soft, and I could feel the heat of a working radiator along one wall. Snow clung to the soles of my boots, leaving damp streaks across the tiled entryway. I set my bag down and kicked off the boots, peeling off my coat. The air smelled faintly of detergent and something else, something faintly metallic, though I couldn't place it. The living area was modest. A couch with slightly sagging cushions faced a low coffee table, and the kitchenette along one wall had the usual appliances: a small fridge, a microwave, a kettle. Everything was functional. Everything looked normal. The bedroom was next, a door that clicked softly behind me. The bed was made neatly, the blanket tucked tight at the edges. What struck me first was that the sheets were warm, uncomfortably warm, as though someone had been lying there recently. I hesitated for a moment, brushing it off. Perhaps the heater ran through the night. Perhaps the host had recently checked the place. I laid down carefully, letting the warmth seep in, telling myself it was nothing. Hours passed in a fog of exhausted sleep. The wind howled outside, the snowstorm relentless. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a subtle sound, faint but distinct. It was a quiet click, like a light switch being moved. At first I thought I was imagining it, a product of too many hours behind the wheel, but then the bathroom light flickered on. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for the glow to spill into the hallway. I froze. My pulse quickened, my mind reaching for a logical explanation. The heater, perhaps? Some faulty wiring? Yet the bathroom wasn't near any heat vent, and the flicker of the light didn't match the rhythm of the storm outside. I told myself it was nothing. Then I heard it. Slow, calm breathing. It was low and measured, deliberate. It didn't sound frantic, didn't sound panicked. It was steady, coming from inside the bathroom, muffled slightly by the door. I sat up immediately, my heart thundering, my hands shaking despite the warmth of the bed. Every rational thought collided with the unease crawling through my chest. I knew the apartment was supposed to be empty. The host had confirmed this. No one else had the code. I rose slowly, glancing toward the bathroom. The door hadn't moved, but the breathing continued. It had a rhythm almost human, almost mundane, yet every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I backed toward the door, grabbed my coat and shoes, and left as quietly as I could. My boots crunched on the snow outside, the wind immediately biting through my layers. I didn't pause to think, didn't stop to look back. I drove away as fast as the storm allowed, streets white and slippery beneath me. I didn't return the next morning. I didn't call the host or report anything. I just left, the memory of that quiet breathing lodged in my chest like a stone. The apartment was real, the sheets had been warm, the light had flicked on its own, and I had no explanation. I don't know who or what had been in that bathroom, and I never wanted to find out. Even months later, I can't think about snowstorms, empty hallways, or slightly open doors without that same sinking unease. The city itself fades from my memory, replaced by the cold glow of that light, the soft, measured breaths, and the certainty that some things in a place that seems normal are not meant to be confronted. I never went back, and I never will. I arrived in the city late on a Monday evening, tired from back-to-back meetings and a long flight. The apartment was advertised as modern, secure, and quiet, right in a downtown building with controlled access. I had booked it through Airbnb for a solo business trip, expecting nothing more than a clean, functional space where I could rest and work in peace. The host had left detailed instructions for entry, and the process went smoothly. I took the elevator up to the 10th floor and stepped into a small, bright hallway that led into the apartment. The interior was immaculate. Hardwood floors, neutral walls, minimalist furniture, and large windows overlooking the street below. Everything smelled faintly of cleaning products, and the place felt almost too perfect, like it had been staged for photos. I unpacked my suitcase and organized my work materials on the desk by the window. The apartment had one bedroom, one bathroom, and a small kitchen area. I noticed a closet in the corner of the bedroom, its door marked with a simple lock and keyhole. It was small, not large enough for much beyond coats or luggage. I had never seen a locked closet in a short-term rental before, and the key was left on the desk with a note that it was for storage only, nothing sensitive. I tucked it into my bag, assuming I would never need it. I went to bed early, exhausted from travel. The city was quiet from that height, the occasional car passing on the street below, faint hums of air conditioning from neighboring apartments. I slept lightly, as I always did in unfamiliar spaces, aware of every creak and shift in the building. Around 4 in the morning, I woke suddenly. I was not aware of any external noise at first, only that something fell off. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate click. My eyes snapped open, and I froze. The sound came from the bedroom. I turned slowly toward the corner, where the locked closet stood. Its door, which had been firmly shut when I went to bed, was now slightly ajar, the gap almost imperceptible. I held my breath, tried to convince myself I was imagining it. The apartment felt different in that moment, smaller and more confined. The faint hum of the city below seemed distant, and every small sound, the refrigerator cycling in the kitchen, the wind brushing against the window, was magnified in the silence. Then I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, something metallic that I couldn't place. It was not the cold scent of coins or the sharp tang of pennies, but a heavier, warmer metallic odor, close to iron, almost like blood. My stomach tightened, and I forced myself to get up, keeping my movements slow and controlled. I reached the closet and hesitated. The door was open just enough that I could see darkness inside. There was nothing immediately visible, no items out of place, no signs of forced entry beyond the door itself. I stepped back, heart racing, and considered my options. The logical part of my mind tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the lock mechanism was faulty, or the building had shifted and the door had opened on its own. I checked the lock carefully. It was in the closed position, showing no signs of tampering, yet the door had clearly moved. I spent the next hour in a tense, restless state, sitting in the chair by the window, watching the street below, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I did not sleep again that night. Every sound seemed amplified. The faint creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of traffic, even the sound of my own breathing felt intrusive. I avoided the closet entirely, unwilling to touch it or open it further. Morning came, and the apartment looked normal again. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, dust motes floating in the light. The closet was closed and locked, exactly as it had been the day before. I checked the lock carefully, tested it with the key, and found it functioning perfectly. There was no evidence of entry, no footprints or disturbance inside. It could have been a mechanical fluke, a draft, or even my imagination playing tricks on me during the half-conscious hours before dawn. Yet the metallic smell lingered faintly in my memory. I packed my things quickly, skipping breakfast, skipping my work obligations for the morning. I left the apartment with a sense of unease that I could not shake. The street was calm, the building ordinary, the city bustling around me as if nothing had happened. I checked out and called a different Airbnb for the next night, choosing a place with no locks on closets and minimal quirks. Reflecting on the experience later, I cannot explain it fully. There was no supernatural element, no threat I could prove, and yet the incident stayed with me. The open closet, the metallic smell, the quiet click in the middle of the night. It had been real, tangible, and deeply unsettling. I considered the possibility of someone gaining access to the apartment without my knowledge, but there were no signs of forced entry, no tampering, and the building had strict security measures. It remained a quiet, lingering discomfort rather than an outright violation. I never stayed in that apartment again, and I left a review that was factual but understated. I mentioned the locked closet, the strange noise, and my concern for security without embellishment. Friends who heard the story dismissed it as paranoia, but I knew the sensation of waking up to a sound that should not have been possible. The memory of the smell, the closeness of the apartment, the subtle shift of the door that stayed with me. The experience taught me to pay attention to small details in unfamiliar spaces, to trust intuition even when it cannot be fully explained, and to value control over my surroundings when traveling alone. I returned to that city later in the year for work, and I chose a different hotel each time, avoiding any space that felt like it could hide secrets behind locked doors. I never forgot the quiet click at 4 in the morning, the metallic scent that seemed to linger in the air, and the sense of intrusion that had no obvious cause. It was a reminder that even in modern, safe environments, there are moments when ordinary things can feel dangerous, when something as simple as a closet door becomes an unexpected source of fear. I learned to move carefully in rented spaces, to check locks, and to note the smallest irregularities. The incident never escalated beyond that night, yet it remained vivid, a grounded, real reminder that sometimes the world does not need elaborate horrors to unsettle you. A locked closet, a faint smell, a soft click, and the unshakable awareness that someone, or something, had been there without permission was enough to make a safe place feel vulnerable. I left immediately and did not return, satisfied with the clarity of my decision, knowing that some discomforts are best resolved simply by removing yourself from the situation. I had booked a small cabin on Airbnb for a long weekend in late October, mostly to escape the city and get some work done in peace. The listing looked perfect, a rustic wooden cabin tucked in the woods just outside a small town, surrounded by tall pine trees and a narrow, winding dirt road. The photos showed a cozy interior, a stone fireplace, and a deck overlooking a clearing. The host reviews were positive, though I noticed a few comments about the remote location and weak cell service. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was looking forward to silence and isolation. When I arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The dirt road had several deep ruts and fallen leaves, and the air smelled sharply of wet pine and soil. The cabin looked smaller in person, but more solid, the wood darkened by weather. I parked, grabbed my bags, and stepped onto the deck. The door was unlocked, as the host had instructed, and I slid it open, stepping into the cool, dim interior. The cabin smelled faintly of wood polish and old carpets. Light from the setting sun filtered through the tall, narrow windows, catching dust particles in the air. The furniture was sparse but practical. A small table with 2 chairs, a couch with worn cushions, and a bed in a corner with a simple quilt. I set down my bags, unpacked a few things, and started to settle in. I turned on the lights, though the bulbs flickered slightly, and tested the outlets for my laptop. Everything worked. I boiled water for coffee and sat at the table, looking out through the window at the forest beyond. The wind rustled the trees, a gentle, constant noise that felt oddly oppressive once the sun went down. Shadows stretched across the floor, long and thin. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept wandering to the stillness outside. By late evening, the darkness was complete. The cabin's single-ceiling light cast harsh shadows, and the fireplace was cold, the ashes undisturbed. I lay in bed with my laptop, scrolling through notes, occasionally glancing at the window. Outside, the forest was black, a wall of trees with no visible movement. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled. At some point, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, something shifting among the trees. I froze, listening. The wind hadn't changed. I shook my head, assuming it was my imagination, and returned to my work. The next morning, I woke early to pale sunlight through the blinds. I made coffee and toast, then went outside to stretch. The forest was still, the air damp with morning dew. I walked down the small slope behind the cabin, where the ground leveled into a clearing with long grass and fallen branches. There were tire tracks in the dirt, old and faded, but no sign of anyone else. I explored a bit further, careful not to stray too far. There were remnants of old fire pits, a half-collapsed wooden shed, and the faint smell of rot in the soil. Everything looked abandoned, untouched for years. It was quiet, peaceful, but I felt a creeping unease I couldn't explain. That evening, I returned to the cabin with groceries. As I cooked dinner, I noticed the door latch seemed slightly loose, though I was sure I had locked it. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the old wood. After eating, I moved to the living room with my laptop and a notebook, intending to work. Around 8, I heard it, a faint sound outside like someone walking on dry leaves. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, deer maybe, but it was deliberate, soft steps, not random rustling. I checked the windows. Nothing. I watched the forest for a long time, eyes straining against the dark. The steps started again, closer this time, circling the cabin. I could hear them move from the front, around the side, then pause. I didn't move. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else had rented the cabin nearby, a neighbor's kid, a hiker, but there was no visible path, no other buildings. The steps stopped suddenly, and silence returned. I sat in the glow of my laptop, pretending to be focused on work, but my hands were trembling. The night dragged on. I finally fell asleep with the lights on, the sound of the wind in the trees blending with my tense breathing. The next morning, I noticed small changes. The latch on the door had scratches, shallow but noticeable. A few pine needles had been swept onto the porch in patterns that suggested movement, not wind. I checked my bags, my food, the corners of the cabin. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place, yet the air felt charged, heavy. I spent the day hiking, trying to stay occupied, but the feeling followed me. Every branch snapping under my boots, every rustle of leaves felt like a deliberate sound meant to track me. On the third night, it escalated. I heard heavy footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin repeatedly. I stayed in bed, watching the window, heart hammering. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear voices, only steps. They stopped suddenly, as if whoever it was had vanished. In the morning, I found fresh footprints in the damp soil near the porch. Not large, not human in a clear sense, but definite. The prints led from the tree line to the porch and stopped at the door. I checked the lock, but it hadn't been forced. It felt like someone had tested it, lightly, with no intention to break in, but enough to make me aware they had been there. I packed my things immediately and left, avoiding the woods and walking down the dirt road to the nearest highway. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything once I was out of the forest. On the drive back, I kept replaying the steps, the movement outside, the footprints. It didn't make sense, yet I couldn't dismiss it. When I returned home, I messaged the host to explain, carefully noting the remote location and the strange occurrences. The host replied, apologetic but vaguely defensive, claiming no one had been there and that the cabin was checked regularly. I never went back. I never rented another remote cabin alone. The feeling of being watched, of deliberate observation, stayed with me for weeks, a quiet reminder that even in the absence of obvious threats, isolation can be more unsettling than any shadow or sound. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. I wanted a quiet weekend away, somewhere I could walk without purpose, breathe air that wasn't heavy with the city, and sleep without the hum of traffic outside my window. I found a small Airbnb tucked into the outskirts of a mid-sized town, a two-story brick house built in the 1940s. Its windows flanked by aged shutters and the front yard scattered with oak leaves in early autumn. The photos showed a tidy interior, hardwood floors, and a kitchen with vintage tiles. The host's description promised privacy and a serene setting. Everything about it felt right. The drive there was longer than I expected. The town itself was quiet, streets lined with empty lots and older homes that had seen better years. As I turned onto the last stretch leading to the house, the road narrowed and the trees overhead met in the middle to form a sort of canopy. Shadows stretched across the pavement, and the sunlight slipped through in patches, mottling the ground. I parked in the gravel driveway and paused to take it in. The house was just as it appeared in the listing. Nothing seemed off. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of must and old wood, not unpleasant, but noticeable. Dust motes floated in the streams of light from the windows. The living room had a faded rug, a couple of armchairs, and a coffee table with scratches along the edges. On the walls were framed prints, generic landscapes, and photographs that looked like they had been left behind by previous guests. I walked slowly through the space, opening cabinets and inspecting closets. Everything was clean, but there was a stiffness to the order, a sense that the house had been prepared for someone who might arrive at any moment, but not really expecting them. I unpacked slowly, placing my bags in the bedroom upstairs. The stairwell creaked under my weight, a low, hollow sound that echoed in the narrow space. The bedroom was simple, a bed with a thin comforter, a small nightstand, and a window overlooking the side yard. I pulled the curtains aside. The backyard was bordered by a chain-link fence, beyond which the woods began. A small shed leaned slightly to one side, its paint peeling. There was no movement, no sound aside from a distant bird calling. I unpacked my clothes and set my bag down, then moved to explore the rest of the house. The kitchen was neat, cabinets stocked with dishes and glasses, a small pantry with basic staples. I brewed coffee in the old drip maker, enjoying the sound of water gurgling and the smell of the coffee as it filled the air. I carried my mug to the living room, settled into one of the armchairs, and looked around. The house was quiet, too quiet, in a way that made me aware of every small sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the siding, the soft groan of the floorboards. I told myself I was imagining things, that the house just had character. Later, I decided to walk the neighborhood. The street was empty, the only sound my footsteps on the asphalt. I passed an old gas station, long closed, its windows dusty and broken. A few houses had for sale signs out front, some leaning, others fallen over. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and earth. When I returned, I noticed the front door had a scratch along the edge of the frame I hadn't seen before. I frowned. Maybe it had always been there. I pushed it open and stepped inside, locking it behind me. That night, the wind picked up. I lay in bed, listening to it whistle through the trees, the branches scratching against the side of the house. Somewhere, a shutter banged softly against the siding. The floorboards creaked with the house settling. I felt a tightness in my chest, an unexplainable unease. I told myself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Over the next day, I tried to ignore it, but small things kept drawing my attention. A door that I had locked the night before was slightly ajar. My keys were not exactly where I had left them. The sound of footsteps above me when I was certain I was the only one in the house. Each time I checked, there was nothing, yet the sense of being watched lingered. I moved with deliberate care, checking each room before entering. I examined the windows, the locks, the closets, looking for explanations. Nothing seemed tampered with, nothing broken. On the third night, the unease escalated. The wind howled more insistently, rattling the windows. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a slow, deliberate knock from the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, heart hammering. I told myself it must be the wind, a branch hitting the siding, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I waited, counting my breaths. Then it came again. I got out of bed, cautiously, moving toward the hallway. The floorboards groaned beneath me. The door at the end of the hall was closed. The sound didn't come again, and when I opened the door, the room was empty. The next morning, I left the house early. I walked the drive slowly, observing the shadows cast by the trees, the empty yard, the peeling paint of the shed. Everything appeared normal in the daylight, ordinary. I returned the keys to the lockbox and left, feeling a lingering tension in my chest. Later, I realized what had unsettled me. The house was fine, meticulously prepared, yet it carried the residual weight of previous occupants. The subtle shifts in the environment, the faint signs of other presences, and the isolation had built an atmosphere that felt personal and invasive. It wasn't any single thing. It was the cumulative effect of small, plausible occurrences, each ordinary on its own, but together creating a sense of being watched, of being intruded upon. I never went back to that Airbnb, and I never wanted to. The experience stayed with me, not because it was terrifying in the conventional sense, but because it reminded me how profoundly ordinary spaces could feel alive with subtle threats. The house itself was harmless, yet my perception of it had changed. I had entered seeking peace and quiet, and instead, I found an acute awareness of vulnerability, the realization that even familiar comforts could feel alien when observed from the wrong perspective. The memory of that house remains with me, not as a story of ghosts or intrusions, but as a lesson in how isolation, small details, and the quiet weight of another presence can unnerve even the most rational mind. I booked the house late in the afternoon, scrolling through listings on my phone while parked at a rest stop along I-80. I had been driving all day from Chicago, trying to make time before dark, but the snow had slowed me down more than I expected. Most hotels nearby were either booked or outrageously expensive, and I was tired enough that I just wanted a place where I could lock the door and sleep without worrying. The listing said entire house, and the price was almost too good to be true. The photos showed a simple two-story house on a patch of land that looked empty, surrounded by trees that had lost their leaves for the winter. The host profile said he wouldn't be there, which made it seem even better. I booked it immediately, and the confirmation came through while I ate a granola bar in the car. I figured I could sort things out when I arrived. The driveway was gravel, narrow, and barely visible through the trees, which were dusted with the remnants of the day's snowfall. When I pulled up, I noticed the house didn't have a walkway cleared, and the snow made the yard look abandoned. The windows were fogged from the inside, and I couldn't tell if the house was heated or not. I unlocked the door with the code the host had sent and stepped inside. The warmth hit me first, but it was uneven. A faint smell of dust and old coffee lingered in the air. It wasn't unpleasant, exactly, but it smelled lived in, like someone had left in a hurry or neglected to clean. Shoes were lined up by the door, and a single jacket draped over a chair in the corner of the living room looked as though someone had just taken it off. On the table, a coffee mug was half full. The surface of the table had crumbs, and there was a faint ring where someone had set a glass. I assumed the host had been in a rush to leave or simply hadn't prepared the house. It didn't bother me at first. I dropped my bag on the floor and started exploring the space. The kitchen was small but functional. The stove looked like it had been used recently, though no pots were left out. The counters had a thin layer of dust, and the sink had a faint odor of soap mixed with something older. I decided to leave it alone. The living room had a couch covered in a throw, and a TV sat in the corner. I flipped it on briefly, then decided I didn't care to watch. The bedrooms were upstairs, a short staircase with creaky wooden steps that groaned under my weight. The carpet was thin, and I noticed faint stains in the hallway. It didn't look threatening. It just looked used, like it was someone's home, not a rental property. I picked a bedroom at the end of the hallway. The bed was made, sheets slightly wrinkled, mattress firm. I unpacked a few things, took off my coat, and tried to relax. It was close to midnight, and my body was insisting I sleep. I woke to the sound of coughing at 2:03 a.m. My eyes snapped open. The sound was soft, raspy, deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the house. Not outside, where the wind rattled the bare branches. Inside, it was hard to place, but I was certain it wasn't coming from a car on the distant road. I froze, breathing shallow, listening. The cough came again, followed by a subtle scrape, like someone clearing their throat quietly. My mind raced. I remembered the host saying he wouldn't be there. I remembered locking the door when I went to bed. My hand found the edge of the blanket, gripping it like a shield. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured, nothing hurried, nothing panicked. They moved deliberately toward the bedroom. My eyes scanned the dark room, focusing on the door. I tried to tell myself it could be the wind, a branch brushing against the siding, but the sound of the steps was too precise, moving over the carpeted floor. They stopped just outside the door. No knock, no voice, just the presence of someone standing there. I could feel the weight of it in the air, the pause in movement that made every small creak of the house seem amplified. I held my breath, trying to gauge what to do next. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't make a sound. Time stretched. The seconds lengthened, each one loaded with tension. I could hear my own heartbeat, thudding in rhythm with the faint, subtle shifting of weight on the other side of the door. It wasn't a dash of fear anymore. It was acute awareness, every sense sharpened. I tried to recall if any doors or windows might have been left open. The front door had the deadbolt. The back door was closed and locked. No windows were cracked. I knew the house was small, a simple layout, and yet this sound suggested someone was moving with intimate knowledge of the space. I thought back to the shoes by the door, the jacket on the chair, the half-full coffee mug. Every detail I had assumed was neglect now took on a different weight. I remembered the creak of the floorboards and the thin carpet that covered them. The steps outside the door were careful, not careless. Someone had been here before. Someone had moved through the house. Not me, not a stranger breaking in at random. This was methodical. The presence was deliberate. I realized I didn't know if the host had sent someone, if they were checking on the house, or if it was simply a stranger with access. The possibilities narrowed into a tight, pressing fear. I finally moved. Slowly, silently, I rolled to the edge of the bed, keeping my eyes on the door. I reached for my phone, careful not to make sound. My fingers trembled, dialing 911 without lifting the phone fully from the mattress. I whispered the location to the operator, keeping the volume low, giving as precise details as I could while still listening. The footsteps moved again, brushing lightly along the edge of the hall. I froze, staring at the doorknob, waiting for any change. After what felt like hours, but was closer to 5 or 6 minutes, the footsteps retreated. Slowly, deliberately, they moved back down the hallway, each step echoing in the silence. I waited until the sound of movement stopped completely before breathing out. I sat there for another hour, alert to every noise, every creak and shift of the old house. The snow outside had settled, muffling distant sounds. I could see the faint light of the street lamp through the front window, painting the living room in soft yellow. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed upright, phone in hand, monitoring the house, willing the night to pass. Morning came with pale light through the windows. I left the bedroom slowly, checking the hallway. Everything was as it had been. Shoes in place, jacket over the chair, coffee mug half full on the table. No signs of anyone else. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside, the cold air biting against my face. The snow had drifted slightly in the wind, erasing any tracks from the night. I left without looking back, driving carefully down the narrow driveway. Later, I discovered the listing had changed. Reviews mentioned the host's absence and cleanliness, but nobody reported an intruder. I realized the house may have been abandoned, that someone could have entered without detection, whether the details I saw were remnants of the last visitors. It didn't matter. The fact remained that someone had been in the house, and the layout, the quiet, the strange intimacy of the steps made it impossible to dismiss. I never stayed there again. I made a mental note to check host reviews more closely, to avoid cheap entire houses in unknown areas, and to trust instincts about spaces that feel lived in despite promises of solitude. Even months later, I could recall the sound of the slow footsteps, the half-full coffee mug, the jacket draped as if waiting, and the pause outside the bedroom door. The memory wasn't vivid like a scene from a movie. It was subtle, grounded, and real. I had slept in hundreds of rentals before and since, but that night taught me that absence does not equal safety, and that quiet houses often have histories you can't see until it's too late. The fear was not from ghosts or monsters, but from the certainty of another human presence. Something deliberate, something entirely real, and that reality stayed with me far longer than the snow-covered roads of the rural Midwest ever would. I had planned the cross-country trip for months, mapping out the route from Chicago to the West Coast, deciding where to stay each night based on a combination of cost and convenience. By the time I reached the city where this particular Airbnb was located, I had been driving for nearly 12 hours. I was tired, restless, and a little irritable, and when I scrolled through the listing, the house seemed like a perfect fit. It promised the entire place to myself, cheap for the area, and the photos suggested a small but tidy structure tucked back from the street behind a narrow driveway. The host profile was minimal but polite, and the reviews were short and positive, though none of them mentioned much beyond the usual check-in and cleanliness notes. I convinced myself it would be fine. When I arrived in the early evening, the house looked exactly like the photos. The exterior was modest, paint slightly faded, the front yard small and unkempt, but I wasn't looking for luxury. I unlocked the door with the code provided and stepped inside. There were shoes lined neatly along the small mat by the entrance, a little too neatly, and a half-full coffee mug sat on the dining table. The smell of something faintly sour lingered in the air, and I noted it as the faint trace of old coffee, or maybe something that had been left on the table for too long. I reminded myself it didn't matter. I would be sleeping and leaving in the morning. I set my bag down, changed into comfortable clothes, and began unpacking just enough to feel settled. The kitchen counter was clean enough, the bathroom towels folded, the bed made. I felt the slight tension that comes with being in someone else's space, the way your body moves more cautiously when everything around you is unfamiliar. But it was nothing I hadn't experienced before in other rentals. Night fell quickly, the kind of darkness that presses in through windows when the streetlights don't reach, and I turned on a small lamp in the bedroom, casting a warm glow over the small room. I laid in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to calm myself after hours of driving and sitting in a cramped car. The house was otherwise quiet. Somewhere outside, maybe 2 or 3 houses down, a dog barked briefly, and the occasional car passed by, but inside it was silent. I set an alarm for early morning, planning to leave as soon as the sun rose, and drifted toward sleep. I woke around 2 in the morning, abruptly, to the sound of coughing. At first, I thought it was from a street, the kind of low, rough cough someone outside might make in the cold December air. I listened, holding my breath, and realized it was coming from inside the house. not muffled or distant, but clear and deliberate, the kind of cough that fills a hallway with its dry rasp. My pulse quickened. I lay perfectly still, ears straining, as the sound receded, replaced by a faint scraping of footsteps on the wooden floor. They stopped outside my bedroom door. I didn't hear a knock. I didn't hear a voice, only the soft weight of someone standing there. I told myself it had to be the host. Maybe they had forgotten to lock up after some last-minute cleaning. Maybe there was some other logical explanation. I wanted to believe it. I tried to rationalize every noise, every shadow. I couldn't sleep again. I stared at the bedroom door, imagining the person on the other side, the way the light from my lamp fell across the floorboards and the edges of the frame. I listened to the quiet hum of the heater, the faint draft under the door, the way the house settled with occasional creaks. Every sound felt magnified. I considered calling someone, but I didn't want to leave a trace that might alert whoever was there. The idea of confrontation, of even a simple explanation, felt impossible in the dark. I sat on the edge of the bed, my back pressed against the headboard, watching the door and counting each minute as if it were a lifetime. The coughing had stopped, the steps were gone, but the presence remained. The silence became heavier, a physical weight pressing against my chest. I realized then that my fear wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It wasn't a storybook scare. It was about another human being, someone inside the same house while I was trapped in the dark. The realization was far more intense, far more immediate than any imagined threat. It was simple and terrifying. I stayed in that position until dawn, unable to rest, unable to do anything but listen for the smallest movement. The first light came through the curtains, gray and thin, but enough to illuminate the room. I got dressed slowly, quietly, and packed the essentials, careful not to leave anything behind. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't check the other rooms. I opened the front door, stepping outside into the cold morning air, and left without a backward glance. The shoes lined at the door were still there. The half-full mug sat untouched on the table. I didn't report immediately. I just drove, feeling the tight knot in my stomach loosen slightly with each mile. The entire way, I thought about what had happened, trying to piece together what the host could have been doing, why anyone would be there, and why I hadn't known until that moment. Later, I left a review, careful to describe the experience without accusations, to warn future travelers without claiming something unprovable. I noted that the listing had promised an entire house, but that someone else had clearly been there at night. I avoided naming the host, but I wrote enough for anyone reading to understand the risk. I never returned to that city. The memory stayed vivid, the quiet coughing, the slow steps outside my door, the way my own house's familiarity had never felt more distant. It was simple, real, and frightening, and it shaped how I approached every Airbnb booking afterward. I never again assumed that a listing meant privacy, and I never again underestimated the weight of being alone in a space that wasn't truly mine.